Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of the group. I've very much enjoyed the discussions and talks so far. The plan for today is for me to discuss the topic of explanation in biology, in particular principles and pragmatics that show up in this space. So in the context of the Platonic Space Symposium, there are a number of topics and themes that have showed up in our talks and discussions so far. There's a number of these that I'll connect up this presentation to. One of the themes that has shown up are discussions and an interest in a kind of standard picture of explanation in biology that is somewhat limited in various ways. There's a standard picture that involves citing various physical elements of physical systems, things like genes, environment, other types of factors. And it's been suggested that this is a limited picture in certain types of ways. One of these ways is that it's suggested that there are various types of forms or patterns that also play an important role in our explanation and understanding of these systems. Perhaps that these forms and patterns are things that impose on, cause, constrain, and in so doing, explain various types of outcomes in ways that we haven't yet or don't fully capture with our ways of discussing and ways of thinking about biological explanation. In my work today, I'll present some philosophy of science research that connects up with this. I'll focus on the topic of explanation, and in particular, causal explanation. There are discussions and there's interest in many different types of explanation in biology. What I have to say today will relate to other types as well, types like mathematical non-causal explanation, functional explanation, perhaps also unifying models of explanation, but causal explanation is just one type that we often discuss in philosophy and that we're interested in philosophy. And part of what I'll do is situate today's discussion around an interesting tension that shows up in this space when we're interested in giving an account of how explanation works in biology. Part of the tension here is that there are discussions of biological explanation being objective on one hand, but also having subjective elements, properties, and features on the other. Part of what I'll also discuss is explanatory relevance in the context of getting clarity here, and how we know when a form, a pattern, a mechanism, a process, how do we know when these are in fact explanatory for a target of interest? And part of what's in the background here, especially in the philosophical work, is an interest in specifying what the criteria are for legitimate and genuine explanations. That's part of what philosophers care to do. They want to be able to distinguish good explanations from bad ones. They want to be able to capture, they sometimes call it the logical structure of explanation, or the kind of recipe or standards that need to be met to know that you have one. There is a lot of excellent work on scientific explanation in philosophy. You see a number of the, excuse me, kind of current books on this topic on this slide, but also many of the kind of important classics that we refer to as well. Philosophers discuss explanation and think of it as a primary goal of science. They often view it as one of the most important projects that scientists are engaged in, and sometimes they just explicitly state that it is the most important project that they engage in and that they do. Here, explanations are ways in which scientists provide deep understanding of the world and a kind of understanding that is distinct from just any sort of modeling. And I'll say a little bit more about this soon. Of course, in both philosophical and scientific work, we often find researchers referring to forms, structures, and patterns as explanatory. Very common to find references to causal structures that are explanatory, causal patterns that are explanatory, forms, constraints that provide explanations as well. Let me say a little bit more about this tension to clarify what I'll focus on today and why this matters. In this literature and also scientific work, explanation is often discussed and described as an objective type of product. Scientific explanations we think of naturally as objective, as rigorous, and as principled. They capture something about the natural world. We don't just get to decide what they are, and they give us some kind of rigorous understanding of a phenomenon, of an explanatory target in the world. On the other hand, it's also common to find claims that scientific explanations also have pragmatic features or pragmatic elements. Explanations are, of course, identified by scientists. They're provided by scientists. Scientists are humans. We have limitations. And there's limitations on the types of detail that scientists have access to, on our cognitive capacities, and on the kind of decision-making processes that we're engaged in. Now, there's different ways in which this pragmatic characteristic is cashed out in philosophical work. On one way in which this kind of pragmatic feature of explanation, one way in which it's understood is a sense that leans heavily on explanations being subjective. So, for example, various philosophers suggest that explanations are subjective in the sense that they're audience relative. Whether you have a good one or not is going to depend on the audience that the explanation is being conveyed to. Interestingly, you find similar types of suggestions in current work on explainability in machine learning and XAI contexts, where there's a suggestion that some of the criteria that need to be met for explainability are things like how satisfying or how persuasive an explanation is to various types of audiences. A similar kind of sentiment here that you find in philosophical work are discussions of explanations as mere verbal descriptions. This is a story that a scientist is providing to an audience, and as you can see here, whether the explanation is legitimate or genuine or good or not has to do with these audience relative features. In my opinion, these types of considerations should start to raise alarm bells in our minds when we're thinking of the criteria that dictate whether we have a good explanation or not. And some of the reasons for this is that it seems pretty easy to suggest and to argue that some audiences are persuaded and satisfied by pretty bad explanations. It's also the case that some audiences are not persuaded or satisfied by good ones. As an example of the former, audiences are persuaded or satisfied by bad explanations, there are various audiences and groups that find explanations of COVID that appeal to 5G wireless networks to be very satisfying, to be very persuasive. Philosophers of science are often looking at the history of science. We're looking at explanations that were provided at different time points. We view some of them as legitimate, some of them as not. And in many cases, the explanations that we think are illegitimate are ones that were very satisfying to audiences. Explanations of diseases that appealed to the religion of the patient, their social status, their social character, the location of the planets. These were very satisfying to audiences of the time. And the worry is if we want to give guidance for what it takes to give a good explanation now, that these types of considerations are going to lead us astray. Namely, that how satisfying or persuasive it is isn't the box that needs to be checked. Of course, it's also the case that different audiences will and do disagree about this, so it'll also be difficult to determine whether an explanation meets this standard or not. The second kind of challenge I mentioned is that some audiences are not persuaded or satisfied by good explanations. If you give me an explanation in physics, a good explanation in the physical sciences, it's unlikely that I'll be persuaded by it or find it satisfying. And that's partly because I don't have the background to appreciate it. So the suggestion here is that these types of considerations are problematic in the sense that they're going to include cases that we view as non-explanatory and potentially exclude cases that we think are real, legitimate explanations. So there's a kind of tension at the very least between how to think of explanations as having an objective character and whether they have a subjective character as well. So how do we think about this? How do we resolve this tension? Part of what I'm going to suggest is a way of understanding that pragmatic feature of explanation that doesn't involve this highly audience relative, subjective notion. What I'll suggest in this talk today is that once you have a well-defined explanatory target in biology, whether a causal pattern or form explains that target is a principled and objective matter. It's not an anything goes type of consideration, and it's not audience relative. However, explanations are also pragmatic, just not in the subjective preference type of notion that is sometimes presented and argued for in philosophical work. Explanations are pragmatic in the sense that they're useful, they're functional, they serve various types of scientific goals. Causal explanation in biology involves both of these. So it's both principled and pragmatic, and there isn't a tension between both of these features. That's part of what I will argue for and part of what I'll discuss. So I'm going to provide an analysis that supports these 2 points, and I'll do so with the following kind of plan for the rest of this talk. What I'll do first is introduce a bit of background on the kind of philosophical approach that I take in my work and that is present in some types of philosophy of science work. I'll give a little bit more detail about how a philosopher approaches these types of questions, topics, and problems. In the second part of my talk, I'll introduce a simple 2 or 3-part model of scientific explanation that helps pin down some of its key features. In the third and final part of the talk, I'll discuss control as an important principle that captures the kind of rigorous objective nature of these explanations, but then also the goal of control, which captures a pragmatic element as well. So I'll start things off with a little bit of background on the philosophical approach that's taken in this work and that you find in other types of philosophy of science work. As I mentioned, philosophers here are interested in providing an account of explanation in biology, and it is sometimes helpful to say a little bit about how they do this and what the standards are for their own work. If you look at research by Jim Woodward, Bill Wimsatt, and many others in this space, part of what's nice about their philosophical work is they're quite clear about what they take their work to be doing and about the standards that they expect it to meet. Wimsatt and others in this space liken a philosopher to a conceptual engineer when they're engaged in this kind of project. They view a philosopher as being a kind of engineer that is assessing how we think of explanation and making sure that our accounts of explanation are both hooked up to actual scientific work, but that they're also functional. This is a type of philosophy that is viewed as functional. It is viewed as having a kind of means and approach in ways that I'll say a little bit more about here. In particular, part of what both Wimsatt and Woodward do is they specify 2 standards that their philosophical work needs to meet when they're providing an account of explanation, for example. The first standard is a descriptive one, and the second is a normative one. The descriptive standard ensures that when a philosopher is providing an account of explanation, for example, that their accounts capture scientific practice, what biologists are actually doing when they give explanations, right? What are the methods they use? What are the explanatory targets they're interested in? What do they cite as relevant to those targets? So this is ensuring that philosophical work is engaged with scientific practice, scientific methods. How, when we're providing an account of explanation in biology, we want to capture how do scientists actually explain. Importantly, we don't want our philosophical work to only meet this descriptive standard. If it does, then we're charged or criticized as being a mere science reporter. You're just sort of saying what scientists are doing. The best kind of philosophical work in this space doesn't just say how scientists do give explanations, it also says how scientists should give explanations. The way that philosophers here provide this kind of meet this normative standard and say how scientists should engage in these projects is they specify the goals that scientists have. And then once you kind of lay out the goals that scientists have, you can say what types of concepts better serve those goals. So, for example, if explanations in biology are intended to meet the goals of providing information about control or prediction, and those are the goals of interest, then a philosopher, a scientist can come into this space and say, well, this is a good explanation and this is a bad one on the basis of the fact that this one meets your goals and the other one doesn't. There's a lot more to say here about this. I mean, you can see entire books are written on this, but this is a way that a philosopher can kind of balance both of these standards. Now, as philosophers, we don't just want to say how scientists should engage in their work or give explanations or think about causation. We don't just want to do that in a way that's separate from awareness of actual scientific work, because if we do, we can be criticized as being mere armchair philosophers, right? So the idea here is that you want a philosophical approach that involves both of these. It meets both a descriptive and a normative standard. This is not easy, in my opinion, for philosophers to do. It requires that they know a good amount of actual scientific work, also that they talk with scientists and take the time to study their methods, study their practice, and also the kind of careful work of assessing what the kind of normative element should be. It's not easy, but it's extremely powerful. One of the powerful aspects of this philosophical approach is that if you do this well, you can give guidance for how we should understand explanation and science. And you can give guidance in a way that's connected up to actual scientific work and actual scientific goals. And if you look at these philosophers in the way that they describe their work, they directly state that it should be useful to science. They sometimes view themselves as a kind of consultant to scientists, and they're very interested in capturing the order of scientific practice. They view science as our best understanding of the world, and they're interested in capturing how scientists do that so well. So they want to capture the success of science. This doesn't mean they think scientists are always right. That's where that normative piece comes up. Sometimes you have two scientists who are disagreeing and they can't both be right. But we can help settle some of those debates by relying on and understanding the kind of principled features that guide scientific work. Just a side note, philosophers here are also paying attention to research in cognitive science, where cognitive scientists study how humans causally reason about the world and how humans give explanations in everyday life. And we're also informed by those types of projects because scientists are humans, and there's a lot of similarity between how scientists causally reason and how we do in everyday life. And so there are lots of kind of connections here between scientific spaces. So this was a little bit of background on the philosophical approach. There is a 2 or 3-part model that you find in philosophical work on explanation that is common across many texts. And this is a model that often starts with first an explanatory target. The fancy word we have for this is explanandum. This is the phenomenon that a scientist wants to explain. We often think of the explanatory target, an explanandum, as something that can be couched in terms of a why question. So a scientist asks a why question like, why is it the case that genetically identical plants reach different heights? Why is it the case that fruit flies have different eye colors? Why is it the case that a neuron is firing with this particular kind of pattern? And on and on and on. You can't give an explanation, you can't judge an explanation or compare different ones until you're very clear about what the explanatory target is. And so we sometimes think of this as the first step in a process of providing an explanation or identifying what explains something in the world. A scientist is very clear about what it is that they want to explain, right? And we often think of this as couched in terms of a why question. The explanation is going to give an answer to that why question. A second piece of this model for thinking about scientific explanation is what does the explanatory work. We refer to this as the explanans. If we're interested in causal explanation, it's going to be a single main cause or a set of causes that are explaining the target of interest, right? Often a set of causes, perhaps ones that are referred to as a pattern or a mechanism or some kind of causal structure. A third piece, or one that's sometimes included in the explanans, is the dependency relation between the explanatory target and what does the explanatory work. In this case, we often think of the explanatory target as dependent on factors in the explanans. We can also look at it in a forward way where we view causes as explaining their effects, right? So when you're interested in what explains a target of interest, you're looking for factors that make a difference to it. You're looking for the causes that make a difference to that target and that explain it. This is an account of, and philosophers here are interested in providing accounts of explanation that are very domain general. Sometimes maybe a little too domain general. Hempel, whose book we have here, he's interested in the way to understand all scientific explanations in all scientific contexts. In more recent work, we've appreciated that there are likely different types of explanations and that even in different areas of science, they probably show up in different ways. Explanation, however, still in this work is viewed as something that is very special, and it's very different from other types of projects that scientists engage in. The standards that need to be met to have an explanation, they're very high. Philosophers distinguish explanation from projects like mere description, mere classification, and prediction. So I can describe the eye color of the fruit fly very well. Doesn't mean I have an explanation for why it has that eye color. I can classify flies into categories, order them, sort them. Still doesn't mean I have an explanation for their eye color. And there's interesting cases where we can give very accurate and reliable predictions, but we don't yet have an explanation. If we have a patient with Koplik spots, white spots in their mouth, we can make a very reliable prediction that they have measles, but those spots don't explain measles. Same with other cases like where a patient has a bullseye rash, and you can give a prediction that they'll get Lyme disease. The bullseye rash can predict that, but it can't explain that disease outcome. These are sometimes referred to as pathognomonic signs. They give you very reliable signs that give you very reliable predictions, right? Same with a barometer in a storm. classic philosophical example. So the main point here is these are projects that are very important in science, but we don't view them as explanatory. We keep them distinct from giving an explanation. Sure, they give us understanding and they're absolutely important, but if you have a model that describes or classifies or predicts, it doesn't mean that you yet have an explanation. So then what does it take to have an explanation? Well, when we're interested in causal explanation, of course, one thing that you need is to identify some causes that are relevant to your target of interest. And in particular, one of the main goals that shows up in the space of causal explanation is the goal of control. So there's an interest in getting information about causes, factors in the world that give you information about what controls that target of interest. And these three different projects here, they don't need to involve control. I can describe and classify and predict without causation and without control. There is an account of causation that is often used by philosophers in this space, many scientists as well. It's the interventionist account of causation, where causation is understood in terms of control, to put it simply, although there's a lot more we could say. So an interventionist account of causation captures the sense in which causes are factors that give you some kind of control over their effects. And so the suggestion here is that one way you start to see causal explanation veering off from these projects is that causal explanations give us some kind of information about control. So first set of suggestions here, in order to identify causes that are explanatorily relevant, once a scientist has specified their target, is to identify causes that meet, excuse me, control criteria. So you're not just interested in any kind of cause, you're interested in causes such that if you were to intervene on them, hypothetically, manipulate them, they would change that target. They give you some kind of control over it, and they make a difference to it. What's underlying this is the suggestion that explanations provide information about what controls the target of interest. And there's a very first minimal standard we can specify, which is that in order for a factor to figure in your explanation, here we're thinking primarily causal factors, well, it's a causal factor that needs to give you at least some control, right? Very minimal control. It doesn't need to give you control always or in all background conditions, or it doesn't need to give you control that is, we could say, highly strong or that boosts the probability of its effect to a high degree. It just needs to give you some. So first standard we could state is just that your explanatory causes need to give you some kind of minimal control over a target of interest. And once we specify this first kind of standard that brings you into the space of identifying factors that are explanatory, we can start to see how a model of causal explanation can handle those cases that we viewed as bad explanations. If someone suggests that 5G wireless networks are a cause that explains COVID, or that a bullseye rash is a cause that explains Lyme disease, the way that we can capture how these actually aren't factors that should figure in our explanations is if you manipulate them, they don't give you any control over the target of interest, right? You can change whether someone has a bullseye rash, maybe you can cover it up, or you can paint on a rash, right? Think of different ways to intervene on and manipulate that rash. That's not going to give you control over whether a patient acquires Lyme disease or not. And same with 5G wireless networks. These aren't factors that are handles in the world that give you control over the explanatory target of interest. We can also start to include cases that we think of as good explanations, right? Germ theory explanations for various diseases, where there's a virus that is cited as causing and explaining measles, for example, right? Interventions on this virus whether it's present or not, have some kind of control over whether a patient gets this disease or not. This minimal criterion, this first criterion of minimal control, can also help us with other challenges that show up in both philosophy and in science when it comes to causal explanation. Some of these challenges have to do with suggestions that for any explanatory target of interest, there's infinite causes for that target. And when a scientist picks some of them as explanatory, they're not doing so in a principled way. They're just causes that the scientist is interested in due to their subjective choice or their subjective preferences. Now, in my view, there's two things wrong with this suggestion. The the first thing that's wrong with it is that I don't think that the considerations that guide explanatory factors is subjective in this type of way. I do think that there are principled reasons. One of them is control. We're starting to see how this operates, in my opinion. The other problem is the suggestion that there's infinite causes for a target of interest. Part of what this framework helps us to see is that this worry is overblown and that the principle of control helps us with these kind of funny, puzzling cases. So one of the puzzles shows up more in philosophy. It's suggested that if you want to explain any kind of target, even things like fruit fly eye color, well, if you look back in the causal history of that target, you can go back for a very long time. You can go all the way back to the Big Bang. And those are all legitimate causes that you would need to cite if you were to give an explanation of the target. Now, when we hear that standardly, it sounds silly. If I went into the hospital and wanted an explanation for my asthma, and a healthcare practitioner tells me the Big Bang is one of the causes that explains it, that I would, find that to be problematic and not a good explanation. But philosophers have gotten hung up on this as a problem. The way that we can handle it is with a notion like minimal control, a way that we can show how the Big Bang is not something that causes and explains all targets that we're interested in, is that it doesn't control them. If you think of intervening on the Big Bang hypothetically, does it happen or not? It doesn't give you control over whether fruit flies have one eye color or another. That's a very fine-grained explanatory target. In fact, I think one way to understand strategies that scientists use to manage complexity is they pick very fine-grained targets that narrows the space of causes that they need to care about. So we can start to handle this kind of case pretty easily, and also cases that I think trouble scientists more, where there's a suggestion that you have infinite regress. Scientists I find in biology and neuroscience, they don't think they need to appeal to lower level details in physics. They think they can cite causes at higher scales, but they're very attracted to a reductive picture where if you just knew more of those lower level details, you could include them, or you should, and you'd always get a better explanation, right? Turtles all the way down is another way this shows up. We can see how this is not the way to think about what kinds of causal details are explanatory when we look at and we think of this notion of minimal control. If we're interested in an outcome like COVID or eye color of a fruit fly, the suggestion is there are variables and causal factors in the world that give you better control over that are at higher scales. We don't yet know of details in lower level physics that give us better control over COVID than our focus on a higher level virus. And there's lots more to say here. The way I typically refer to this and think of this is that explanation isn't a game of how low can you go. It's a game of what gives you control. And in some cases, once you specify the explanatory target, the factors that give you the best control, they're at higher scales. So you never know from the outset what scale of factors are going to be more explanatory. This also suggests that just always getting more lower level details doesn't automatically give you a better explanation. I think one thing that shows up here too is a confusion between accepting that there are lower level physical details and whether they're explanatory or not. Someone who thinks that for an explanatory target like eye color in fruit flies or COVID, that the best explanations are a particular gene variant or a virus, they're not denying that there is stuff at lower levels of physics in these systems. They're denying that that stuff is explanatory. So just being present in a system doesn't automatically make something explanatory. One of the other points that I'm kind of suggesting in this talk is explanations are very selective. Scientists can't cite all of the details out in the world, but they also don't need to reach their goals. So neither of these kinds of challenges meets this criterion of minimal control. Part of what this shows, in my view, is this is a criterion that is excluding the right types of cases. So minimal control is required for explanatory relevance, but we want so much more than this, right? We don't just want causes or factors that give some kind of control. We often want our explanations to identify causes and factors that give more control and better control or ideal control. One way that this is done, of course, is by identifying many causes that are working together in producing these outcomes of interest, right? Most explanations in biology are citing many interacting causes in integrated kind of groups that are sometimes referred to as causal patterns or mechanisms or forms. So I think one reason for including more causal detail in an explanation is it gives you more information about control over your target, right? And if your goal is control, then that's going to be information that is functional, it's useful, it serves that goal. So a number of ways in which this is done is by getting more information about causal intermediates, of course, like opening up that black box, but also identifying different types of causes that have different types of control. The minimal control standard allows you to say that something is causally relevant, but it doesn't allow you to distinguish different types of causes from others. Causes can differ with respect to how stable they are. Do they hold across changes in background conditions? How strong they are, how fast they are. There's a lot more to say here, but a kind of overarching suggestion is that first you want minimal control, and then you want more of it, and then you want kind of better control. Now, better and ideal control is partly going to be dictated by the kind of control that a scientist cares about in some space, but you can see that this is a more systematic and rigorous notion than they woke up that day and their subjective preferences led them to choose one factor over another as explanatory. So I mentioned that this kind of tension is part of what we're interested in this space, that explanations in biology are objective and that they're subjective. So what is objective about this picture of causal explanation in biology? Part of what's objective about this is if you give me a well-defined explanatory target, the factors with control over that target are determined by objective principled considerations that have to do with causal relationships in the world. I don't get to determine what factors provide control over that target or not, right? That's dictated by objective information about the causal structure of the world. What's pragmatic about this, if that's an objective kind of feature? Well, the scientific goal of control, I think, isn't objective in a clear-cut sense. Scientists are interested in this goal in ways that aren't, coming from nature, is maybe one way to put it. It's also a goal that's useful. And it kind of serves various types of functions, or it's something that they can use to do things with. I think another feature of biological explanation that doesn't fit in the objective category is the choice of what explanatory target a scientist picks in the first place. Part of what is interesting here is that you can specify these objective principled kind of guidelines for what is included and excluded from the explanons or your explanation, but that's only once you pick an explanatory target. And part of what's interesting is that across the sciences, we have researchers interested in different types of targets. And I do think this is a place where more kind of pragmatic considerations play a role. I also think that what is less appreciated with respect to those targets is that while there are some considerations that are pragmatic, I mean, they just might be more interested in explaining certain types of outcomes versus others, but there are some criteria that explanatory targets need to meet to be well defined. There are better and worse ways to specify explanatory targets. And I do think both philosophers and scientists don't always appreciate or discuss what these are, right? In philosophy, we're interested in explanation and we just sort of start with the explanatory target, but we move on pretty quickly from that. And we start looking for explanatory relevance criteria and how do you know what explains that target? It's non-trivial for scientists to identify the right kind of explanatory target. And there's a lot of precision that you need here to have one that's well defined. What do I mean by this? Well, one feature that needs to be met for a scientist to have a well-defined explanatory target is they need to specify a contrastive focus. So if I say that I'm interested in explaining why a patient has sensation loss in their hand, and I want to explain that, what I need to say is I want to explain loss of sensation in the hand as opposed to what? As opposed to full sensation in the hand, or as opposed to a lack of sensation in the leg. You always have to say as opposed to what, or else it isn't clear enough yet. It's the same with fruit fly eye color. You want to explain red eye color as opposed to what. If you don't specify the contrast, then you can have two scientists who think they're trying to explain the same thing, but they're not, or the explanatory target is ambiguous, right? So you need a contrastive focus, doesn't need to be binary, but you need to say as opposed to what. A second feature that explanatory targets need to meet is that the terms that are used to capture the target need to be defined in a way that's sufficiently precise. In this philosophical space, we are thinking of causal modeling, and we think of that explanatory target sometimes as represented by a variable that captures a property in the world. One way to specify this second feature here is you need to say what property in the world your target refers to. And sometimes we use terms in science that are, again, ambiguous with respect to what it is in the world that you want to explain. So we're interested in explanations of consciousness or intelligence. And of course, there isn't a consensus definition of these. Sometimes researchers are defining them in different ways. Well, if they're defining them in different ways, then they're not interested in explaining the same thing. So it needs to be the case that we specify exactly what it is and how that term is defined. What kind of property in the world are they interested in? Of course, the same word can be used to refer to different things in the world. We need to unpack this so that we prevent cases of crosstalk where we think we have different explanations for the same thing, but we're not even interested in explaining the same thing from the get-go. And of course, in these spaces too, with explanations of consciousness and intelligence, maybe it's actually better to unpack all sorts of different explanatory targets in this space as opposed to the whole right explanation for intelligence, which might just be too broad of a notion if we want it to cover all cases. A third point that I'll just very briefly mention without going into too much detail is that I think explanatory targets that we choose also need to be ones that are controllable by things in the world. This is a very interesting feature, and I think this captures one of the hard problems of scientific explanation, because typically when you're specifying the target, you don't know what the causes are yet for that target. We see this in psychiatry, we see it all over the place, where researchers are trying to specify a particular disease outcome first so that they can identify the causes. But we often specify explanatory targets in medicine on the basis of a shared causal process for the target. So when you group patients together and you say they have schizophrenia or disease Y, you're hoping that they all have the same shared causal process that produces their disease outcome, but you don't know that yet because you don't know the causes. So a target needs to be something that is controllable by factors in the world. There are various ways that scientists work to get around this problem, sometimes by specifying a target, looking for causes, and on the basis of what they find, they'll go back and redefine the target, or they just start with candidate causes, intervene on them, see what they produce. But this is a very interesting kind of hard problem of scientific explanation. So to summarize some of the main features that I think causal explanations in biology have, and part of what is showing up in this analysis, causal explanations are very selective. They're choosy. Not all details matter. Scientists, I mean, they can't cite all of the details in the world, and they don't need to. Explanations are very selective. They're also principled. There are rigorous principles that guide what types of factors are explanatory. This isn't a overly subjective or capricious project where they're making random decisions. I've mentioned control is a key feature here in understanding these principles. Explanations are also relative to an explanatory target. We can't give them, we can't justify them, we can't judge them until that target is not only specified, but specified in a well-defined way, which involves some of the considerations I just mentioned. Explanations are also piecemeal. This is in contrast to views of explanation that are sort of like a theory of everything type of project, where you want the kind of full one main explanation for the whole system. Part of what this analysis suggests is that for any system of interest, you ask different types of explanatory why questions about different types of aspects of some phenomenon of interest, and what explains those targets differs depending on the question that you ask. So it's kind of this piecemeal picture of needing a precise and narrow explanatory target, and only then does that pick out the causes, explanatory factors that are relevant to that target. I've introduced some explanatory relevance criteria here: control, minimal control, better, ideal, and perfect control, and then just getting more control, more factors that give you more information about what controls that target of interest. In conclusion, explanation is something that we should view as very important, right? If we want to capture successful explanations in science, there's a lot riding on doing this well. Whether we say something is a good or a bad explanation has many implications, right? You can think of explanations for disease outcomes. If you specify the causes that explain a disease outcome, part of what you say is that those explanatory causes are responsible for the disease, they're to blame for the disease, and that's what you need to target with resources or with medical interventions to remedy things. And it's possible to get that wrong, and it's possible to get that right. This isn't a anything goes, this audience likes it and that one doesn't type of situation, right? That's what I'm arguing for. It's important to capture when explanations are right, when they're wrong. It's important to do this if we want to capture the success of science, which isn't an anything goes type of project. Part of what we're looking for here are guiding principles that we can use to inform other cases where scientists are trying to explain targets that they're still working on that are perhaps more complicated and more difficult. We want to identify the standards for success so that we can use them as guidance in other types of situations, right? If explanations are subjective or audience relative, I don't think we can do these projects well. Yes, there are some features that are pragmatic, but they're not as loose as some of these ways in which subjective considerations are discussed. So this is a kind of project that is working in this space of philosophy needing to meet both descriptive and normative standards. We want philosophical work to capture the success of science. We want it to be useful for science. It should give us guidance, it should give us advice, and it should be motivated by successful scientific work. There are explanatory relevance criteria that I've introduced in this work, primarily with causal explanation. I think it's important and interesting to think of how they bear on other types of explanation that we might be interested in. And part of what this argues for is a picture of explanation that involves principles and pragmatics that are present in biological explanation and without tension. Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks so much. Questions, discussion, opening the floor to everybody. If while people are thinking, can you talk a little bit about one of the things that I'm most interested in is mathematical facts and structures as explanations, and this idea that both in biology and well, I mean, I think there could be a distinction made where physics is sort of constrained by it, but biology really exploits these things. But this notion that like it just seems to me that um most, if you keep asking why long enough, you end up in the math department, right? Like why, and then eventually it always ends up being some sort of symmetry property of some mathematical object or something that well that's why, from the cicadas and the prime numbers and all this to like just everything. Can you talk about that a little bit and how you see that? How do you see what we call mathematical facts as explanations, especially in biology?
Sure. The book at the lower part of this slide, Explanation in Biology, that I recently finished, provides a review of types of non-causal mathematical explanation. I'll pull up this picture here. There are a number of these non-causal mathematical explanations that are thought to fit this same kind of picture. It's just that the connection between the explanans and the explanandum isn't causal. It's said to be a mathematical dependency relation. So you'd still want to specify some kind of target of interest, but what that target depends on, or sometimes what it's constrained by, is some kind of mathematical property. So a this is used to capture the Königsberg Bridge case that is viewed as a constraint-based explanation. Mark Lang, whose book shows up on a number of these earlier slides too, his book Because Without Cause, discusses non-causal explanations in physics, and he often views these mathematical explanations as constraint-based explanations is what he calls them. So part of what's a little different between those cases of mathematical explanations is they constrain the target. And for Lang and others, that's a stronger relationship than a causal one. For Lang, constraints are giving, in some cases, what he calls impossibility explanations. That's another difference. So they sort of tell you what you can and can't have, or what you can and can't do. And that's just different from a causal explanation telling you what you have control over, in terms of different possible outcomes of a target. So in the Königsberg Bridge case, the proof that Euler provided is explaining why it's impossible to walk an Eulerian path through this set of bridges. So that's kind of one category of non-causal mathematical explanations. They're sometimes called topological explanations or constraint-based explanations. The math is constraining the target. And in some cases, there's graphical models that are used. Other types of non-causal mathematical explanation are the optimality evolutionary ones, like you mentioned, the cicadas and prime number year life cycles. And there's a number of others that fit into this category. Why honeybees have hexagonal shaped honeycombs and why sunflower seeds are distributed in like a Fibonacci sequence on a sunflower head. There's a role of like optimality and and yeah, I wonder if those have the most connection to the cases that you're interested in because those mathematical properties are sort of exploited by evolution, or maybe a way you would prefer to understand it is they kind of constrain what's going to show up at all.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
that
I think
Mhm.
I worry that constraint doesn't quite do it justice, and yes, in many cases it does better look, it does effectively look like a constraint. But what I see is, especially in biology, is uh, that you get more out than you put in. So in other words, and that's not as much a constraint to me as an enablement. In other words, you make some sort of minimal input, whether that's some basic assumptions you've made, some axioms, or whether you make a simple, as if your evolution, you find a voltage gated ion channel, but that's actually a voltage gated current conductance, basically a transistor from which you can make logic gates, and you inherit the properties of the truth table and the fact that NAND is special and all this kind of stuff. You didn't have to evolve any of that. You got that, for free. And there's all this, like, to me, it looks like a bunch of these things are free lunches that not so much constrain. I mean, they, in a sense, they constrained what you could do because you were seeking for optimality and success. But really, what they do is they enable you because, right, because for minimal inputs, you then are handed a bunch of stuff that you didn't have to evolve from scratch. So I feel like focusing on it as a constraint tends to yeah, it tends to prevent us from realizing how many of these what look to me like a kind of free lunch that you get in some cases, for mathematics. Um,
Yeah, no, I think it would be interesting to look further at how both of those fall apart. I do see how the constraint framework focuses more on the sort of borders of what you can't do and less on what you can do in this kind of possibility space.
hmm. Okay. Anybody else? We're getting to the top of the hour. So, did anybody else have anything? Leo, go for it.
Hi, Lauren. Thank you very much for the talk. Um, is it, I picked up the message from you that you were not so interested in distinctions between the observer, that you somehow made the assumption that the observers are rather homogeneous or like a view from nowhere type of view. That in essence, I picked up that you were sort of saying, well, you said something like, you can't have anything goes, but equally, if you put in observers with different kinds of capacities, right, that are sensitive to different kinds of patterns, then you could have, in your view, quite different kinds of things going on, right, depending very much on who's observing, right, and then especially when then in a sort of cybernetic second order term, when you put the observer into the system itself rather than sitting outside the system, you get a very different kind of view. So I'm just wondering whether in this view of causality that you've created is that you're framing a particular, you're framing a homogeneous set of observers against a rather clearly defined sort of context, where there are these kind of constraints on control. And by the time I've said all that, you could sort of say, well, that sounds like classical science. But I'm wondering how well it fits, with biology and circular processes and observer dependence. So that was the sort of thing that was coming up when you were
Yeah,
making your distinctions for me. Yeah.
good. So this account and accounts in this space do pride themselves on including scientists and their cognitive capacities, strategies they use, heuristics, and their limitations. The heterogeneity of their interest is captured in terms of different explanatory targets and um, and different types of methods, different types of different things they want. But once you specify what they want, the idea here is that it isn't an anything goes type of project where you have multiple valid explanations for the thing of interest, that you can say once they specify their goals, whether a model or an explanation is meeting those goals or not. And this captures how there is consensus, right? When scientists are but that's once they do specify their target in a sufficiently precise way. The heterogeneity that you're discussing, I would place that more in terms of the different explanatory targets that they are interested in, which vary quite a bit. Also, whether they want a causal explanation, whether they want an explanation at all, or whether it's a non-causal explanation of a different type. So I think what we want here is a way to capture how scientists do reach consensus when they're providing explanations and when they're engaged in certain types of projects. It isn't anything goes, but there are very different types of targets of interest. And I think earlier models of explanation in philosophy did view explanation as a kind of one size fits all thing. Now we're more pluralists, but it's not an anything goes pluralism. You still have to specify the principles, but this is partly, I mean, there's a lot of interesting kind of topics here to pin down. Are we well capturing the kind of variety of explanatory projects across the sciences, even if it's just biology? And that's non-trivial, but the objective and subjective considerations do kind of show up in that space.
Okay, I think I've got it. Is that it's not that you're proffering a kind of preferential mode for causal explanation, you're contouring what it means for an explanation to be causal. Is that right?
Oh, so the minimal criterion needs to be met for factors to be causally relevant to the target, but that there's a whole set of distinctions within causation and different types of causal systems. So knowing you have a causal explanation is one thing, knowing what kind you have is a whole other. Scientists are referring to causal systems as mechanisms, pathways, cascades. These have very different features. So here today, I just really mentioned what gets you in the door of having a causal explanation, but there's types. There's a whole landscape of types of causes, causal relationships, and causal systems that figure in explanations. It shows up in philosophical work when there's interest in distinctions within causation. And so there's a whole kind of landscape there, but we also want to capture pluralism there too.
Thanks. Yeah.
Axel, I think you want to ask a question, right? Oh, we can't talk. You wrote it in the comment. He asked,
Axel, can you say more?
Yeah.
Yeah, Axel, can you say more about about the connection of the reproducibility crisis to what part of the model? In what way? In terms of establishing causality?
I would just get because I think from your house I get on 495 north, and I would just head to Worcester after. And I could work from somewhere.
Someone's mic on.
Yeah, because I have tennis at yeah.
So in terms of establishing causality, the account that I use, the interventionist account, the kind of minimal criterion that are needed is it needs to be the case that in some set of background conditions, an ideal intervention on the candidate cause that manipulates that cause and that cause only in an ideal way, which there's a lot more that could be said about this, provides some type of change in the values of the effect variable of interest. And so that doesn't need to be established across kind of all background contexts of interest. So it would, so it's a pretty minimal criterion for causality. I think the reproducibility crisis is going to relate more to expecting both that we have the right kind of experimental setup, but also if we're interested in causes that are more stable. This sometimes comes up also when there's an interest in how sensitive or insensitive they are and in robustness. So just having causation and distinguishing it from mere correlation requires minimal control, but that there's many other kind of extra, I think of them as secondary features that causes can have or lack or have in different degrees. So so yeah, being able to, I guess that's what I'll say now, but I'm not entirely sure what further kind of connection you're interested in here. But interventionism is just a minimal criterion for causality. We often want and expect a lot more from our causes. It distinguishes causes from non-causes. But in a very narrow set of background conditions, it doesn't need to be a cause in a broader set or all cases of interest. It doesn't even need to be a cause that gives you or has other features that we think of ideal or paradigmatic causes as having, like strength, stability, operating on a certain time scale of interest. So yeah.